This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 32 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And for today's episode, we'll be looking ahead to waiver wire targets for week 9 of the fantasy season. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow us on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Now verified. Again, we are at FFAlchemistPod. And you can email any questions to fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's start with the tight end position, because our priority ad this week is going to be Cardinals tight end Trey McBride. Now, coming into last week, McBride was 9th in the league in receiving grade according to PFF. He was 5th in yards after the catch, and he was 3rd in yards per route run. Now, the issue when he started the year is that he was playing backup snaps to Zach Ertz. A few weeks after that, he was splitting snaps pretty evenly with Zach Ertz. Of course, Zach Ertz then goes on IR, so week 8 was his first full start as the full-time starter at the position. And he also went against the Baltimore defense, which had been pretty good against opposing tight ends on the season. Now, pending Monday Night Football, Zach Ertz is currently your tight end 1 on the week. Ertz played 82% of snaps. That was a season high. He had 10 receptions on 14 targets. He had 95 receiving yards and a touchdown, 25.5 points. And McBride is currently available in over 90% of ESPN leagues. Based on this result, in combination with his success on a small sample and then now his success here in week 8, where he had a 38% target share and broke out for 25 fantasy points, Trey McBride should be an automatic top 10 start at the position, and you can get him for free right now in ESPN leagues. And the other tight end, if you're feeling like you want to gamble, is going to be Taysom Hill of the Saints, currently owned in 15% of ESPN leagues. Now, Taysom Hill has put up 3 good games in a row, and he's being used in all kinds of ways right now in the Saints offense. Now, he's had 14 targets in the last 3 games. He caught 12 of them. He also has had 3 rushing touchdowns, including 2 against the Colts on Sunday. In all, Taysom Hill is averaging 17 fantasy points a game in his last 3 games, and he will be a startable tight end moving forward. The next 2 weeks, he faces the Bears and the Vikings. Now, Hill is always going to be kind of the boom-bust play. For instance, Hill only played 29 snaps on Sunday, a 43% snap participation rate. But given the weekly tight end landscape, if you need to shoot for upside at the position, Taysom Hill has been a top 10 tight end over the last 3 weeks. Now, as for the wide receiver position, there are 3 rookies that I have been highlighting for the last few weeks that the market still seems to be a little bit behind on, and that is Chiefs receiver Rashee Rice, Seahawks receiver Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Colts receiver Josh Downs. All 3 of those players are just slightly over 50% ownership right now in ESPN leagues. All of them need to be much higher. Now let's start here. I'm going to prioritize these, but let's start with Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, despite Watson's return and Hardeman's increased role, Rashee Rice's percentage of offensive snaps increased slightly on Sunday. He led the wide receiver room, as he has done for a number of games now. He led the wide receiver room with 4 receptions for 56 yards. Rice's snap and route participation continues to trend slightly upward here in the last few weeks, and he has now clearly become the number 2 fantasy option in the Kansas City offense. As for Colts rookie Josh Downs, he had another 14 fantasy point game on 9 targets on Sunday. Now, since week 3, he has been incredibly consistent. He has averaged 14 fantasy points a game on over 7 targets. Again, Josh Downs available in almost half of ESPN leagues. And then lastly, Jackson Smith-Njigba, JSN. And even with DK Metcalf back in the lineup on Sunday, JSN was at a 65% snap participation. He has had a touchdown now in back-to-back games. Now, I wouldn't recommend JSN as a start going forward, but he is a high priority stash in the event that Metcalf or Tyler Lockett were to miss a game. And then lastly, at the wide receiver position, I will mention Marvin Mims of the Denver Broncos, currently owned in 7% of ESPN leagues. Now, Mims is really a fantasy community darling due to his second in the NFL with a 3.42 yards per route run rate, highly explosive player, but he has just not had anywhere close enough to the amount of playing time yet to be fantasy relevant. Now, the reason he is mentioned here is really more of a speculative ad in the event that either Jerry Jeudy and or Cortland Sutton were to get traded ahead of the trade deadline. If either of those players were to get traded, that would open up the necessary playing time for Marvin Mims to become fantasy relevant. At the running back position, I will mention 3 players here. First, we'll start with the Cardinals backfield with Emari Demercado, currently at 39% ownership in ESPN leagues. Now, Demercado had the most snaps of the Cardinals backfield on Sunday, even though he barely played in the fourth quarter with the Cardinals in a negative game script. However, his opportunity share in the backfield was excellent. Demercado had 20 carries plus 1 target on Sunday. Teammates Keontae Ingram and Damian Williams, they each only got 3 opportunities, and opportunities again are carries plus targets. Demercado played 41 of a possible 49 snaps over the first 3 quarters of that game. Now, I will caution you that Demercado still finished with less than 10 fantasy points in that game, and James Conner is eligible to return from IR in Week 10, so I would tread lightly here. Another player to keep in mind will be Tyjae Spears of the Tennessee Titans at 36% ownership right now. Again, another speculative ad in the event that Derrick Henry were to get traded this week. Now, it was announced prior to Week 9 that the Titans were unlikely to do that. However, it is still a possibility. Spears continues to see solid playing time with limited opportunity share compared to Derrick Henry. Spears is performing well with the limited opportunities he is getting. Again, not a player that you can start as of now, but a priority stash in the event that circumstances change. And then lastly, Seattle Seahawks' Zach Charbonnet, currently owned in 30% of ESPN leagues. Now, for the first time this year, Charbonnet outsnapped teammate Kenneth Walker, 32-24. Charbonnet received a slight increase in playing time on early downs and short yardage situations, likely due to Walker's calf injury that limited him in practice all week. Now, the big difference in snaps occurred on 3rd downs and 2-minute drills. Charbonnet and DJ Dallas had been sharing that role prior to Sunday. However, on Sunday, Charbonnet completely took that over. Similar to the Titans backfield, Charbonnet is another priority stash in the event that Kenneth Walker's injury were to worsen. Now let's talk about the quarterback position, where across the league right now there's just a lot of injury attrition that happened on Sunday, and I'm sure a number of people will be looking to the waiver wire for both short-term and long-term solutions at the quarterback position. First, let's talk about Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray, currently owned in 32% of leagues. Now, I have been advocating Murray for a few weeks now. I thought there was a good chance that he would be back in the lineup in Week 9. However, the Cardinals already announced that they will wait another week, so it looks like Week 10 will be his return date. Now, given the attrition at the quarterback position, Murray is an excellent bargaining chip for any trade deadline move for a quarterback-needy team. Or you can just stash him as your QB2 as a streaming option for when your QB1 is on bye. Now, I won't rehash everything with Murray, but again, this is a guy who is a career 20-point fantasy scorer, and he should be a high-priority waiver claim. And then lastly, Giants quarterback Daniel Jones has kind of been forgotten. He is currently at 34% ownership in ESPN leagues. Now, of course, Daniel Jones is coming back from an injury. It is announced that he will start Week 10 against Dallas. Now, admittedly, his last start against Dallas went horrifically bad. He only had 4 fantasy points in that game. However, Daniel Jones was a top 10 quarterback last year and is one of the most underrated rushing quarterbacks in the league. Jones has had at least 9 rushing attempts in 3 of his first 4 games this year. Now, I'd look to avoid his Week 10 matchup with Dallas, but his schedule the remainder of the season is pretty favorable, with Washington and New England the following 2 weeks, and he has a very good stretch of matchups during the fantasy playoffs. So that'll wrap up episode 32. Make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be back with more episodes this week. Midweek, we'll do a full recap of key observations and trends from Week 8 of the NFL season. And then prior to Week 9, we'll look at some recommendations on players you should not be afraid to start. So for Dustin Chandry signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.